Okay, hey guys. So here's this podcast that I promised you today on the first two sections of photosynthesis, first two sections of chapter 2. The way that you should look at this is just an introduction to photosynthesis and to stage 1 of 2 stages in photosynthesis, so not 3 or even 4 like we had in cellular respiration, but just 2. And you should really look at this as an introduction, not a comprehensive lecture on exactly what you should be looking at with photosynthesis. You got to spend some time with this on your own, just like I said with cellular respiration. But this is meant to give you a little push and a little bit of help in understanding what's going on in your textbook and decoding some stuff. So photosynthesis is actually a really similar process to cellular respiration. They're inherently very related, and this is something that you go over pretty much through your entire career in science, elementary school, middle school, biology, and now up to AP biology. We're just going to go into a little bit more of the biochemistry here. But to start out, just generally with what you guys know, if you're looking at a diagram like this, which is actually a really great diagram, we've got photosynthesis involving a plant, right? And there's also some really key ingredients that are happening here, and also some really key waste products that are happening when it comes to ecology and life on the planet. So first, what we're going to focus on here is sunlight, which is going to be our ultimate source of energy in an ecosystem. It's what allows life to organize, to decrease entropy, ultimately, right? Which is what this plant here is going to do. So sunlight is one of our key ingredients. Notice also going into the system here, which is a plant, is carbon dioxide. So that's going to be an input. And then water is also going into the plant here. What's leaving is a byproduct of oxygen. And remember, in cellular respiration, that was actually one of the reactants that we needed in order to drive the reaction. So that's how these two things are inherently very closely related, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, besides having some key characteristics in common with each other. So just like we had an equation for cellular respiration, we have an equation here for photosynthesis also. So in photosynthesis, what we're saying is that we're going to have 6 moles or 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 moles of water. We're going to react that with some light energy. So these 3 things are our reactants. And then through a process of a bunch of enzymes and a bunch of biochemistry and a bunch of metabolic pathways, what's going to come out of that is we are going to get some glucose and we are going to get some oxygen gas. Right? These are the things that we are going to go ahead and get. Something that you guys should be able to do is look at these reactants and decide, well, which ones of these are going to be oxidized and which ones of these are going to be reduced. You can pause the video here for a second, and then I'm going to go through the answer of which one of these are oxidized and which are reduced by looking at the products on the other side. Okay, so first let's look at the carbon dioxide here. Remember, one of the indicators that something is accepted electrons is that it now has some hydrogen, right? So if I look at this carbon-containing compound here of carbon dioxide, on the other side I want to go find the carbon-containing compound, and that's going to be the glucose here. Notice what the C and the O has gained. It's gained some hydrogen, right? So in this case, we know that this has gained some electrons. So what I would say here is that this carbon dioxide is going to be reduced to glucose. It's going to gain some electrons. So we know that glucose is going to get some electrons. I also see here that water is going to oxygen gas. So what I can understand here is that water is actually going to lose some electrons, and it's a good bet that it's going to lose hydrogens also. So water on this side is going to be oxidized to oxygen gas because it is losing its electrons. Remember? Okay, so there's our equation for photosynthesis. Notice that it's the exact opposite of cellular respiration. So if I was to take this arrow and flip it around, I'd have glucose and oxygen gas reacting to produce water vapor and carbon dioxide. These two are very closely related. That's why we talk about them also in ecology. So where does this happen? This happens in a special double membrane organelle called the chloroplast right here. It's what gives plants their green color. And this image is something that you guys should be very familiar with. So this goes over the ecosystem level of how these two processes are inherently related with one another. So here we have our light energy coming in, and here's our system. Chloroplast is going to be our little factory that goes through our system here. Here's our products going in. We've got carbon dioxide and water going into this chloroplast. You're going to mix that with light energy, right? So just like we had on this previous slide, there's those ingredients heading into the chloroplast. Out of this, what we get is some organic molecules, and in this case, we're going to call those glucose. And we also get oxygen gas as a byproduct. That's great because these two things are the inputs into this process in the mitochondria called cellular respiration, in which we get ATP out, right? And then ultimately the way that that energy is going to leave the ecosystem, which is here in this blue box, is as heat energy. So energy is going to escape. We've got energy coming in the form of light. Ultimately, it's going to leave as heat going through different systems. Then as an output from the mitochondria, we have carbon dioxide and water, which again goes into the chloroplast. So again, remember, one of the big ideas here is that matter cycles and energy flows. So what this is showing is how our matter is cycling through these two processes, how cell respiration and photosynthesis are inherently related with one another because they recycle matter between these two processes. Light energy, however, is something that constantly needs to be input into this system. And heat energy is always something that's leaving. So this is something that we always need. This is how energy flows through a system. It's not cycled, it's flowing through a system. And that's one of the big ideas at the ecosystem level of how these two processes relate. A big key component that gives these chloroplasts their green color and which makes them really useful for absorbing this light energy is this molecule here. So if you just look at the structure and the function of this molecule, you can see that it's got sort of like a handle here on the end, it kind of looks like, and then it's got like a big scoop. And these things actually aren't too far off from what you might see and the function that you might see in real life. To me, it kind of looks like a spoon, and we know that spoons are really great at collecting things. So is this. So what this actually is this is a molecule of chlorophyll, which is a pigment. And a pigment is just a special compound, a special molecule that's really good at absorbing light. And the main one that we look at in photosynthesis is called chlorophyll, right? So this is what chlorophyll looks like, and it comes in two big flavors here in photosynthesis. It comes as chlorophyll A and also as chlorophyll B, in which there's just like some slight changes here. Here there's a little methyl group on top, and here there's a CHO group sitting on top. They're very, very similar to one another. Now, when we look at a plant, when we look at the color of a plant, we see the color green, right? That's not a big surprise. Whenever we see plants represented, they're always green, and that's for a very specific reason. So what I'd like to show you here is the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and then also a secondary pigment called the carotenoids, which is what gives fall leaves kind of their color when chlorophyll starts to go away. Here we've got wavelength of 400 all the way up to 700. So these are the longer wavelengths. These are in the red range. These are the shorter, higher energy wavelengths. They're in the purple range. What I'd like you to look at this blue here. That's chlorophyll A. The green one here is chlorophyll B. And then the yellow line here is the carotenoids. Look where there's a lot of absorption, right? Look where there's a ton of light being absorbed. And that's in the red and the blue range here. You see these really big peaks of where these are being absorbed. And then there's also some here in the red range in which a lot of energy is being absorbed. And then there's hardly any in this range. Nothing's being absorbed. Everything would be being reflected in this case. Well, when we see color, what we're actually seeing is wavelengths being reflected off. Right, so what this is showing us, if we were to look at this, and we could do this in lab if we had enough time, I would love to do that with you guys, but we are a little bit behind. With chlorophyll, what we've actually got is green light being reflected and red and blue actually giving the energy that we'd actually need. These wavelengths are what's useful in photosynthesis. This is not useful because that chlorophyll won't absorb the green color. Okay, so what's happening when a photon or a little bundle of light actually hits a chlorophyll molecule? This is a really similar thing to what you guys saw in chemistry class when you did like the flame test. And what you did is you had some metals and you excited their electrons and they fell back down. And when they fell back down, they released a little bit of light, right? So what we're looking at here is a little chlorophyll molecule, a model of a chlorophyll molecule, which has electrons in it. When a photon comes down from the sun, what it ultimately does is it excites the electrons in the chlorophyll, and that's a really, really big deal for what we're about to look at in photosynthesis. We're going to try to excite some electrons. We're going to jump them up in energy. They're jumping up in potential energy. We're adding energy to the system, ultimately from light exciting electrons. When that falls back down, when the electron goes back down to its ground state, what will happen is it will release a little bit of heat, and it also releases a photon, and in this case we can see that as fluorescence right here. So this glowing is from photons being released from the excitation of chlorophyll. Right, so that leads us into these systems, in which photosynthesis is divided into two systems that you'll be responsible to know. It's really important, just like in cell respiration, that you know the inputs and also the outputs of these systems. So the first system that we'll talk about, and the first system that your book discusses, they're called the light reactions. Okay, these are called the light reactions. Why? Because light is one of the things coming in here. We also notice this is where water is going to be an input, and look at one of our outputs here. That's oxygen gas. So along with oxygen gas, the things that we have as an output are NADPH, and we've also got ATP here total as an output. Right, and those are going to go into our next system right over here, which we'll talk about in a separate podcast, and those are called the Calvin cycle. And this is a separate process here, sometimes also called the dark reactions. Not a great name because they don't necessarily have to happen in the dark, but we're going to focus on this one right here to start. Okay, so here's a little bit closer view of where this is actually happening. Let me back up real quick. We're looking at these things right here, which are called this whole thing is called the chloroplast, and these things here are called the thylakoids. These thylakoids is where these light reactions are going to take place, and this is just a zoomed up view of the thylakoid. So here's the thylakoid that I was just showing you, those flat little green discs, and then on the outside, sort of the cytoplasm of the chloroplast is called the stroma. And there's some really important things to point out here. So here what we've got is a couple of photosystems. We've got photosystem 1, and we've got photosystem 2. Excuse me, photosystem 2 is here and photosystem 1. 2 comes first, then we've got 1 sitting right over here. We've got a few key players that you guys should be able to identify when you're looking at this. Number 1 is we've got some water right here, right? So I'm just going to go in order. So what we've got is light coming down, and it's going to hit one of these proteins. That's actually going to excite electrons, just like we saw what happens in chlorophyll. Those electrons that are donated here to chlorophyll are actually going to come from water. So there's some enzymes that are sitting right down here that are going to take some water and they're going to split it. They're going to split it into protons or H pluses. They're going to drop off those electrons that bound the H's to the oxygen, and they're going to donate them here to the chlorophyll, so they'll jump up in energy. They get excited. They're then going to split that water, and this is going to be dropped off as oxygen gas. Oxygen gas then is a byproduct of the light reaction. So this is something that you need to know, that ultimately where oxygen comes from, all the oxygen that we breathe, all the oxygen that's produced by plants, comes from the splitting of water, so that these electrons can be donated to this electron transport chain to chlorophyll right here in the thylakoid space. Okay, so ultimately these things are going to jump up in energy. Notice now that they're also, this should look sort of familiar to you with how the system looks in cellular respiration. This gets to our second key point of what's happening here. As the electrons jump up in potential energy, they're going to start to fall down this electron transport chain. And that fall of potential of those electrons is going to drive these H pluses from low concentration to higher concentration. So they're going against their concentration gradient. When they're moving against their concentration gradient, they need potential. They need energy in order to do that, and that comes from the falling of the electrons in this second photosystem down to this electron acceptor. These electrons are going to keep falling, and then these H pluses are going to build up in very high concentration in the thylakoid space here. They're then going to move on to photosystem number 1, in which another photon will come down and strike that chlorophyll, and they'll jump back up. So they've gained some potential energy after they've lost some in order to drive those protons down into the thylakoid space. Now that they're all the way up in potential energy, they need to be dropped off somewhere. Those electrons need to go someplace. We can't just get rid of them. And that leads us to our third key component here in the light reactions and what you'll need to know. Remember NAD plus from cellular respiration, that can get reduced by accepting hydrogen and some electrons to NADH. This is sort of the photosynthesis cousin of NAD+. We've got NADP+. So what this little enzyme does right here is it's going to take an NADP+, it's going to accept the electrons that came from photosystem 1, it adds those here along with a H+, a proton, and when we do that, we get NAD+ being reduced to NADPH. And that's one of our inputs into the Calvin cycle. Remember that we also built up a lot of proteins here in the thylakoid space. So there's a ton sitting right here in the thylakoid space. Those need to go someplace. And where they'll want to go is naturally from higher concentration to low concentration. Notice there is an enzyme right down here. You guys have seen this enzyme before. You saw it in cell respiration and oxidative phosphorylation. The same thing is going to happen here. that we saw in cell respiration. This is going to go from high concentration with only one escape to low concentration here on the other side of this lipid bilayer. So they have to escape through the ATP synthase. When they do that and they fall through, they're going to provide the energy necessary to phosphorylate inorganic